Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
In our Farm Basics time today, we're going to talk about how farmers know when to harvest their crops. We had a great example of that right here, Brian, in this particular wheat field. We had wheat that the stems were green, and so it looked like, oh, that plant is still growing, but the grain was all dry. How do you know when it's time to go?
Okay, so the whole thing is, if you're a non-farmer, and the reason why we're bringing this up is because we've gotten this question from non-farmers, and they say, well, how do you really know if you should be out there then, or a week earlier, a week later? It varies so dramatically based on the crop. So we'll just give you a few examples today. All right, with wheat specifically, what we're looking at is the grain, and that grain needs to be fit. And with many different grains like wheat, corn, and so on, we're looking at the moisture percentage that's actually in that grain. So for example, in wheat and corn, we'd like to have that moisture percentage low. If the moisture percentage is not low, then we can't store that grain in a bin. With the wheat, we'd like to have that wheat moisture at, let's say, 13% moisture. Now we've harvested wheat at 17 or 18% moisture, but the problem is then as a farmer, you have to spend money to dry that grain down because grain elevators will only accept grains with so much moisture in them.
Well, if they do take grain that's a little bit wetter, what they do is charge the farmer for that. Well, hey, we're taking some risk here because we've got too much moisture in that grain. We've got to dry it down. And the other thing about that is, besides the drying expense, is you're going to have some shrink loss. Think about it this way. If a farmer is selling grain that's 20% moisture and the elevator wants it at 13 to 15% moisture, depending on the grain, well, that elevator is going to have some loss because the farmer is actually selling them a whole bunch of water in the truck. Now, granted, they aren't adding water to the truck. That would be illegal. But there is water inside that kernel that the grain elevator really doesn't want to pay for.
Okay, now Darren, you brought up a good point. So with corn, grain elevators will take that corn with no dock at 15% moisture, and some of them even 15.5% moisture. Well, last fall, corn got really dry in a lot of the country just because of the way the year went and extra heat units and everything. Same kind of thing is happening this year. So some farmers are out harvesting corn at 12% moisture. And you say, well, if you could actually have a little more water in that grain and get it up to 15% moisture, you could in effect sell some water for a good price. So why can't you put water on there, Darren?
Well, that's just going to create problems. You know, there's one thing if the water is actually integrated inside that kernel. It's another thing when you spray water on top of a kernel, you're going to have a lot more spoilage. And you just can't control how that grain's going to act.
And the whole point is, what Darren said earlier is it's illegal. You can't actually do that. So,
well, okay, let's look at it this way. When we talk about soybeans, for example, soybeans can dry up really quickly out in the field. They can go from being 13 or 14% moisture in the beans on a real hot, sunny day. They can drop a couple points very easily, and all of a sudden you've got soybeans at 11%. Now, when an elevator will actually buy them at 13%, a farmer wants to be as close to that 13% as possible. They don't want to lose that moisture that they could get paid for in the grain. And in fact, in some processing plants, they'd prefer to have a little bit more moisture in the grain. So farmers are trying to do it at the right moisture percentage. Now, if you've got beans that are starting to dry out, hey, we had a hot sunny day yesterday, now they're down to 10% moisture. Well, guess what? We had a heavy dew this morning. The plants are all wet, and some of those kernels will actually soak some moisture back in. So farmers, if beans are way too dry, they'll try to harvest in the morning if they can. Now, it's tough to cut the stalks and everything in the morning, but they'll try to get going as soon as they can when those kernels may have just a little bit more moisture than they will in the afternoon.
Okay, so that's a little about harvesting grain. And for Darren and me, we farm corn, soybeans, and wheat. We don't have any livestock on the farm anymore, so we're just after the harvest of grain. Now, there are some corn farmers who want silage, and then it's whole different. They're not looking at the moisture in the grain, they're looking at the moisture overall in the plant. And they're going to be cutting that corn for silage 2 to 4 weeks earlier, at least, than what we would be harvesting that corn for grain, because they want more moisture in it, and that silage is actually going to ferment in a silo or some other storage spot that they have.
Well, one other thing that farmers may harvest is alfalfa hay. Now, if farmers are going to cut hay, it's going to be green and full of blooms perhaps and actively growing. But farmers will cut it, they'll leave it lay on the ground out in the sun for a few days so that hay can dry out a little bit, and then it'll be safe to bale it up so they won't have a big wet bale in the barn.
Yeah, but let's talk about that. As soon as you see the first flower out in that alfalfa field, you want to take that off, because at that point, you're maximizing total digestible nutrients. If you let that alfalfa field get lots of flowers on it, you've now lowered total digestible nutrients. You may have more total alfalfa that you've cut, but you don't have as many total digestible nutrients.
And it varies a little bit depending on what farmers are doing. Now, let's get back to the corn, soybeans, and wheat. You may be deceived driving by some fields that are all green. And you say, wow, there's still a lot of green leaves out there. Well, that field can't be ready. Or you may look at another field and say, well, it's totally brown. I guess it's time to go now, and you may be way too late. So we do really want to look at the grain in grain fields. If you're harvesting corn, soybeans, wheat, and other crops, for the grain, we want to look at what the grain is for moisture percent, not necessarily the plant.
Well, as you can see, there are a lot of different things that go into deciding exactly when to harvest, and one of those things, unfortunately, can be if farmers have a lot of our Weed of the Week. We'll tell you how to stop this weed on your farm coming up later in the show.